right. Hello, everyone, and welcome again to today's webinar. My name is Carlo Bobilis, and I'll be your moderator for this session. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Tech Advocate for Cisco Learning Certifications, Jason Belk. But before I hand over the mic, I have a few housekeeping items to cover about today's presentation. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available on demand after the live session. We'll make sure to put that information at the end. If you experience any audio issues, I've placed a call-in number in the chat. I'll do it again shortly, but you should see on the screen itself as it kind of rolls over to the next slide, information. But again, I'll put it in the chat if it's not there. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and pass the ball over to Jason. Jason, over to you.
Thanks, Carlo. Hi, everybody. I'm Jason Belk. I'm a senior technical advocate here in the Learning Certs organization. So my background, for those who missed the first part, go back and check it out. Lots of basics, cover lots of great stuff. But I was in Cisco IT for several years in the network operations implementations team, the campus and branch side, starting into automation, got more into teaching automation to everyone else because this is before DevNet and everything else getting started. And I just love sharing the things, making it easier for other people to get started, especially network engineers. So what we're going to share today is primarily for network engineering audience and all the examples in using Ansible. Carl, if you can give me the ball, that way I can share. So yeah, basically for Ansible itself, it is an automation platform. And today we're going to be doing a little bit of review in the first couple minutes just to show you what we're working with. We have an inventory file, and I'm using NSO Reservable Sandbox just because I like the topology. I'm used to it. But I'm using Ansible. It's just a nice set of network devices for me to work with. So on the right here, we have our inventory file. We have Internet Router 1, Dist Router 2. These are both iOS style devices. And we're not going to be worrying about the IP addresses as much, but just remember for the examples as we're going through them, when we see Internet Router 1, Dist Router 2 working with iOS under the grouping of routers. And for the switches, we have Dist Switch 1 and 2, and those are going to be Nexus devices. And credentials and stuff like that for lab stuff, I'm not worried about exposing that because I'm on a private VPN on the DevNet sandbox. So the first main topic that I wanted to cover, following up from what we were discussing last time, is talking about Ansible's variable management system. And this is, I think, really important to drive home in understanding how Ansible works, because after you do some basic, show commands and some basic config lines, you're going to start working with multiple devices. You're going to want to have different configuration pushed to different devices. So your routers are going to have different variables than your switches, but you might want to use the same templates in certain areas like Snmp or AAA config and other stuff like that. So what I'm going to show today through demonstration and then give some examples in the documentation is the Ansible variable system, which basically means that as Ansible is running, it stores all the variables that it has in its system, and then it gives a precedence based on which one is more important or less important in a hierarchy. And the general rule of thumb that I keep in my mind is like the more general is trumped, is superseded by the more specific. So the different places that you can store variables in Ansible is first off in the inventory file. I don't have any custom variables here. All the ones I have here are actually built-in variables within Ansible, so I'm not going to be superseding those in my examples, but that's one place you could store variables. You can also store variables within the playbook, but most commonly, you're going to see variables in your host vars and group vars. And so these are actually reserved names in Ansible. They're directories that it looks for in the current working directory where you're running Ansible. And so if I misspelled that with host var without an S, it would throw an error and say I can't find the variables and stuff like that. And then it also has the naming conventions of these YAML files are actually tied to what I have in my inventory. So if I actually pull that up back on the side, we can see my group vars. We have a default all group that has all my variables for all of my devices. So this is what I'm talking about, the more general. The more general, these variables will impact all the devices and be stored along with all the devices when I run my playbook. So whenever I run any device in my playbook, it's going to have a site code of this 2_LX and then Snmp variables that we'll get to later. And then more specifically, if you go from all of our devices, we can then talk about we have a group of routers and then a group of switches. And then we have specific variables per devices. And so the groups are going to then supersede the all group, and the specific groups are going to be superseded by a specific device variable file. So these YAML files, this is one thing that was confusing for me when I first got started, are not the same as the YAML files that we're using for the playbook. If you remember, for our playbook, the playbook structure has the hyphen, it has the name of the play, it has the host, it has all these special keys that we're using to structure our playbook. But just because we're using YAML in one place doesn't mean we can't use YAML in another place in a different way. And so in our variable files, it's just simple key value pairs or lists, basically using YAML to store data, regardless of what the playbook says. We're just using YAML to store data here. And then based on the names of these files, they're tied to what we have in our inventory. Our inventory is really the heart and soul of how Ansible uses its naming convention. So based on how I spelled our names here of our groups, of our device names, it's going to then, when I run Ansible, look into my group vars and host vars specifically named directories and look for a group vars routers.yaml because I have a group in my inventory called routers. It's going to look for a switches.yaml because my inventory has a switches group named in it. And then subsequently, it also will look for host vars for specifically for each device. You can then have variables that supersede the more general group variables. And we have the naming of our devices, our inventory, then match the name of our variable names in our host vars. And these are optional. You don't have to have them. But when you do have them, then that supersedence comes in. And one thing I do want to point out, I'm pulling up here, and we have the links on the GitHub repo in terms of if you want to look up later. But we have in the Ansible documentation a whole list of exactly where that supersedence happens, from the more general at the top here, of like I was talking about the group vars, all the way down to you can supersede and have variables basically overwrite during runtime at the playbook level as well. I'm not going to spend too much time on the documentation page, but that's a good place to reference later on if you're looking for it and you're trying to do one versus the other. So I'll take the inventory out now just to kind of save some space, and I'll show the first playbook and show how this works in action. So just ignore the second play here for now, and we'll just focus on the top play here. So what we have here is a playbook that on the first play, it's going to connect to all my devices. So we have our routers and switches for 2 Nexus devices and 2 iOS devices. Our first task is basically going to create a directory that we're going to be putting some files in. So we're not even talking to the network devices in this example. We're just going to be seeing the variables and actions that are associated with the different devices within Ansible. And remember, when I run each task, because I have all selected for my host, it's going to then run this for each device in my list, except for here I've run once true, which I'm not going to talk about right now. But all that to say is we have our module here with Ansible built-in template. So we're using the template module. We have a Jinja 2 template called variable-precedence.j2. So it's going to run in, it's going to create this outputs directory, default precedence directory, basically a place for me to store my files. Then I'm going to create the files where I'm going to dump it in that directory. The name of that file is going to be the variable precedence, and it's going to be dumped into that outputs directory I just created, into the subdirectory of default precedence I just created. And then inventory host name is the current running device name of whatever it's running. In this case, it's going to do it 4 times. So it's going to create 4 files for each one of my devices, the 2 iOS XE and the 2 Nexus, underscore the name of the device, underscore variable precedence.txt. And so now let's look at that variable precedence.j2 file. And that's in the templates directory, which is specifically named in Ansible, and it looks in the current working directory for a templates directory. And then you can see I didn't give a path here because it knows it's going to be in this templates directory. So we have our variable precedence.j2. And this is actually not like a network configuration file. This is just a straight text file that I put some Ansible variables in to show what it's going to look like. So we have the Ansible variable precedence, good to know about, blah, blah. We have some variables here. It's going to print out the current inventory host name, basically the current device name. And then there's another built-in variable that I looked up in the documentation called group names. That's a list that says, here's a list, Python list of all of the groups that this device is a part of. And in there, I know it's just going to be one group because each of them are in one group. I'm just going to take that first entry and print it out here to the file. And then we're going to print out the site code for this device is. And this is really where the example comes in, is I'm showing that as it's running for each device, it's going to print out the name, it's going to print out the group that it's in, and then it's going to print out the site code. And that site code is actually going to be different based on the variable precedence system that I've set up. And this is a good example for you to go through after the webinar and look at all the interlocking details, because I'm not going to be able to spend too much time on it, but just to say that We have a site code as what I call like a default baseline of LAX, 2_LAX. We have, so if there's no variable at all across any of the devices, at least it's going to get LAX. And then we have no site code variable in our routers, so there's nothing going to be superseded for the group variable for routers. We have a site code of 3 RTP, so if there's a switch, it's not going to hit the all, because first it's going to hit the group of the RTP one before it hits the LAX from all, if there's no variable defined at the switch level. So for example, disk switch 2 has a site code of what I call 5 New York City. So basically I have this variable defined called site code, and specifically since the device level variable is defined, it can ignore all the more general ones. So it's going to print 5 New York City onto this template here. So the 5 New York City is going to get plugged into the site code on my template for this particular device. And if I look at disk switch 1, move it up here, you can see I actually added a comment to point out that I have no site code variable defined at the host vars level for this particular device. So it's going to say, uh-oh, I don't have a device level variable. I'm going to look up for my group level variable, which is going to be switches. And I'm going to see, oh, I have RTP as a switch. So in that case, disk switch 1, since it doesn't have a host var defined, it's going to look up onto the switches level and plug in 3 RTP. And then if we look at disk router 2, it also has no, this one actually has a site code of 4 BGL for Bangalore. And so for this iOS device, it's going to have this particular variable defined of BGL, and it's not going to look anywhere else. And then lastly, for our last iOS device, I have no site code variable defined up here at the top. I added a comment just to point that out so we don't have to look. And so it's going to look up, oh, do I have any variables defined at my group level? Oh, I don't have any variables defined at my group level for routers, unlike switches. Oh, so I'm going to go one level up, and then, oh, I do have one defined for my all of my devices. And so when we run this, we'll see those particular outputs in the files. So Ansible Playbook -I inventory, and this is our 0 Playbook variable precedence. And so it's going to create those directories. It's going to then do all of that fancy variable precedence, looking at the stack ranking between them, and then plug them into the outputs. And if we click here, we can see we have an outputs directory that just got created. We have our default precedence files that just got created. So I'll close these over here, and we can see disk router 2. If you remember, it's hit the 4 Bangalore, so it has a host var level defined, so it's going to do that and forget all the other ones, part of the routers. That's the name of the device name. Then we'll go look at Internet Router 1, the other iOS device. And remember, I said it doesn't have any host vars defined. It doesn't have any group vars defined for its group. So it's going to hit that all.yaml variable for LAX. And for disk switch 1 and 2, we have the ones we defined there, 3 RTP and New York City. And like I said, this is one that you really want to work through yourself, but just going quickly through it, that gives you examples of how the group vars and host vars have a precedence level within them, and it's easier to see when you have the variants showcased for you. So now seeing that example in action with some configuration will probably help bring it home a little bit more than talking about just generic site code variables plugged into a random text file. And so what I have here is showing a couple different things. So we have in our second playbook, one.precedence config Snmp YAML. So we're going to have an Snmp template, which I'll open up here to the side. We have simple Snmp server community contact location, and then it's going to pull in basically from this Snmp variable from our group vars and host vars for the read-only, read-write, contact, and location. And for our playbook itself, it's going to run for all of our devices. Our first task is going to look up this particular template and feed that in for all 4 of our devices. And then our second one is going to use the Cli Command Module. And last time I showed iOS command and XOS command, but you can actually, even within Ansible, do more generically, just Cli command. And then if you have all your syntax right, it will then send it to all your devices regardless of the OS type. So we have here, we're doing a show run pipe include the variable name just to make sure that the Snmp is present. So the first one is going to configure the device using this Jinja2 template as the fed in, and all those variables in the background are going to be fed in automatically because they're associated with each device at runtime. And so we're looking at snmp.j2. It's going to feed in all these variables. I'm not going to go through every single variable in every single group like we did last time, but just to show you that we have group vars set up for these variables. So we have an overall snmp hierarchy within our YAML variable in our group vars. And we have our snmp.ro. You can see snmp.getRO, snmp.getRW, contact, and location. So it's going to feed in these variable values into our dictionary look up here for our Gen 2 template. And we have some of them I've omitted to show precedence. And this is one you definitely want to go look through on your own. But I have basically some devices have SNMP variables defined, some of them don't. And so it's going to then take all of those SNMP variables, feed them into the Gen 2 template. And then once that template is rendered, then push it to the device on the other side. So let's do that. Let's pull Playbook. There's my inventory. And so it's pushing, it's rendering the config and pushing it all in one task. I usually like to do that in separate tasks just so I can review the configuration before it's sent, but this gets pretty simple and just for demo purposes. So we have, if I scroll up, our first task, it sent those commands. So we have for Internet Router 1, it sent the RO, it sent these particular commands. And then for task 2, we did the show command to make sure that those were present. So for variable precedence, it's definitely something that you want to practice with and get used to. But really, the general rule of thumb is the more general the variable system is more trumped by the specific. And I'd say most people use variables in group vars and host vars, even though you can technically define it at the play level. In the previous playbook, I didn't mention, but we had a second play here, which also I defined a variable at the play level. So within Ansible, you can define variables all over the place, even at the command line when you're about to run it. That's usually the highest level precedence. One of the other highest level precedences, and which I usually use for troubleshooting, is defining variables just at the play level. So in this case, I defined the site code in my second play from that previous playbook as SFO to precede all the variables otherwise. And so just as a good troubleshooting technique, you can always define your variables within the playbook itself. And that makes it easier than rather trying to hunt down all the different places where your variables are stored. And let's move on to our second playbook. We have here build and push NXOS SVI config. So we have, when we pull up the SVI, we have NXOS SVI. So now working with the switches. Open to the side. And in this case, we have some variables called VLAN, and it's going to have a subvariable called number and name. And those numbers and names are going to create either the VLAN number, interface VLAN number, and then have a description of that name. And basically, we have standard layer 3 interface VLAN here, and we're plugging in the IP address, the name and number of those VLANs. And on the playbook side, we're going to work with just the Nexus devices, because in this case, our Nexus devices are the switches, and our iOS devices are the routers, and we're not going to put VLANs on the routers. And so our first task is to make sure the config directory that we're creating exists of config SVI. Our second task is going to look at this Gen 2 template. It's going to feed in the inventory hostname as the path name and load in all those variables from the group vars and host vars. And then it's going to take that Gen 2 template and then feed it to an output file in a config directory. And I'm going to take that config directory, which usually you'd want to review it beforehand, which is why I've separated these versus the previous one where we rendered it and loaded it all in one go. It's usually better to review your config before you're pushing it to your devices. And so in this case, we're going to have our config on a text file that we can look at. And in this case, we're going to push it in the next task, and it's going to back it up to our local directory and then do a verification command of show IP interface brief to our underlying devices. And if we look at our variables, remember we're just working with the Nexus switches here. We can see here for interface VLAN, VLAN number. I think I have it on the group vars. Yep. And so we can see here I didn't have anything defined in our host vars because in this case we just haven't defined the same for both of our switches. So we have a VLAN on our switches group vars for 1 through 37 being our VLAN number. Our VLAN name is going to be SVI demo. And then I have an IP address of 172.16.107, which if we look here for IP.get address, I have the last digit of the .1 and the .2 actually just predefined in the template because it's going to be the same place every time. And the first three octets are going to be the ones that might change. And so if we run Ansible Playbook, -i inventory, and this is 2. So our first task is we're going to create that outputs directory, which is going to have our SVI config. It's then going to load in that SVI config per device. In this case, the variable is actually going to be the same because we have it defined at the group vars level. And then it's going to push that config to the device and then do, I think, show IP interface brief verification command. So we can see we have our name SVI demo VLAN 1337, interface VLAN 1337, our config 172.16. Whatever /24. And then if we look at here, our verification command for disk switch 1, we have VLAN 1337 is showing up on our show IP interface brief with our particular IP addresses. And so one thing I do want to show here is we have our variables here. And when it comes to building these config templates, it can actually take a decent amount of time to get your structure right. There's a lot of flexibility in Ansible on how you want to define that. It doesn't really tell you whether you want to use nested dictionaries or list of dictionaries. But one tool I found is having a visualization of your particular Jinja 2 and YAML, because you don't want to have to run your playbook every single time that you're just making sure your config actually works. And what I found is having like a web way to render your configuration and then just kind of play around with it until you get it right, and then put it in your playbook to push to your devices. So at this point, you're just kind of sculpting the text, regardless of what it's doing behind the scenes in the networking. And what we have here is one of two tools that basically do the same thing, more or less, that I want to show you. One's called TD4A, created by somebody on the Ansible team that you can look on his GitHub, Code the Network, great guy in terms of content he's created for this type of thing. So you can dump, rather than having to chase down group vars, host vars, decide the variable precedence, just for straight testing, you can create your YAML on the left here. You can create your config in the middle and start adding your variables in. Like, I didn't start with all these variables. I started with the end result and worked my way backwards with my variables and started plugging in the right variable names. And we can see here we have VLAN number, VLAN number, VLAN name, VLAN name. And then when I clicked render, it actually went through and rendered the config. So it's not magically doing it, it's just saying, okay, well, ignoring all the group vars, host vars, just look at this as a straight text template. We have our variables on the left, our template in the middle, and then it's going to render the output on the right. And also, there's another one called TTL J2 Live that has a lot more kind of bells and whistles to it that I'll show you in the next example, but this one is a little more beautiful in terms of the CSS styling, so I like to show that one first, because it has all the syntax highlighting and all that kind of fun stuff. And this, you can actually run it locally and have it plug into your Ansible variables if you want to. I usually don't do that just because it's easier to just kind of toss things in there, do it on the public website, and then move on my day. So for the next example, we're gonna show one little trick that makes, I think, people confused oftentimes when they first run into it with Ansible. For our last example here, so with Ansible, I think 3.
Jason, are you up for a couple quick questions?
Well, let me go through this example and the next example, and then we'll see if we have time for questions.
All right, sounds good.
It's easier to follow up afterwards. So in this next example, and these are related in the sense that we're also going to be doing Jinja 2 templates. In this case, instead of doing layer 3 SVI with a VLAN, we're just doing straight iOS interfaces, and I'll pull up over to the side. So we have more complicated Jinja, and if you've worked with Python or any type of coding languages, this shouldn't be too out of the question. And even if not, like, I think after you go through a couple examples, you'll kind of get the hang of it. But basically within Jinja, you can do more than just straight variable substitution of like plug in this variable here, it goes to the other side. You can also do what we call looping, where you say for each interface in my list of interfaces, I want you to have a particular, we'll go here, okay. So ignoring this Snmp part here, because that was for the previous example, we also can just dump other variables into our host vars for one of our internet routers. We can see here we have a Jinja YAML list where I have a name, description, IPv4 address, and subnet, and then have each of them named as you expect, as loopback 200, 201, 202 through 204. Our descriptions named, our IP addresses and subnets named here in our list. And basically from there, I'm going to feed those into our template to create a bunch of interfaces for iOS. And I'll show what that looks like here on the renderer, because I feel like that is usually a little more intuitive than just running a playbook and looking at a text file. And I can kind of move these around. And so one thing you'll notice here is we have our interfaces. So basically I have 0 through 4, so 5 different interfaces, and then it creates the same interfaces on the right here from one template. So if you start having repeatable configuration, you can start abstracting your configuration a little bit more rather than listing out every single interface. You're like, oh, it kind of does the same thing. I just need to plug in different variables. And I'm going to say for each interface item, which is my iterating object in this case, for my interfaces, which is the name of my variable here on the left, interfaces, and then I made up this variable name here called interface item. So it says basically for each interface in my interface list, go through each sub-object, and then I have interface item.description, which is description over here, interface item dot IPv4 address, and same thing as subnet and all that. And so what we have here in our variable is completely mapping exactly to what it should be. But we also have some conditionals and other things going on here and some indentation. You'll notice that our indentation is kind of messed up. That this is not how, like this no shutdown shouldn't be over. This actually is double spaced over where it should be. There should be only half as much spacing here. And this is based on how Ansible renders templates by default. And because Ansible was designed for compute scenarios, not network engineering originally, it has some little quirks when you're doing networking that you kind of have to account for. And so one of those that I gave this example for is that when you're doing looping and conditionals and some other things that you can look up in the documentation examples that I've given in the README file, is that you're going to have some indentation spacing issues that may or may not break your configuration depending on how bad it is. And what you're going to want to do is add into your templates specific Jinja 2 basically additional configuration lines. So this is at the top here, a comment that says Jinja 2 lstrip blocks is true, trim blocks true, which when we render the configuration, this first line is not going to show up. It's basically telling Jinja 2, configure these 2 optional parameters so that way the spacing doesn't mess up. And there's pretty much no scenario where it's very uncommon that these special configuration of the Jinja 2 templating engine is going to mess up anything else. So you almost always want to have these enabled if you're building templates for your network examples. And what we have in the other, remember I said there was this other templating example from TTL2255, and he has a good Twitter account, good stuff on network automation. Definitely check him out. So you can put your Jinja 2 template in here at the top, and he has little helpers, and then you put your data in. Just dump my data from the other one, and then he has these additional kind of options. So I can say, oh, I'm doing rendering mode with Ansible rather than just Jinja 2, and then that trim and lstrip that I was showing in my top here, lstrip and trim blocks. He has those as optional parameters within your web form as you're doing your development. And so if I don't have those enabled and I just click render template, you can see all the spacing is just all wonky. And so what we have here, if I add just the trim, it's going to fix one part, but then you still have kind of weird spacing here. And he actually has a little option here where you can see all the white spaces, all the carriage returns, all the little dots for all the spaces. And I think when you're getting down to the nitty-gritty details, this is a really helpful tool for people to see. If I add the other option, which is lstrip, it's not going to fix just the huge spacing between the lines, but also the indentation side. So trim and lstrip definitely really helpful. Almost always want to have them enabled for your Jinja 2 templates. And those are the 2 main examples I wanted to make sure and get to before we finish. And the last playbook I have here basically just removed the demo config, which don't necessarily need to show. So yeah, what was the last question?
Sorry, Jason, you caught me off guard there.
Sorry.
So let's see here. Let me just kind of skim back here because yeah, I assigned a couple questions to you. Did you happen to see those? Oh, it looks like Carlo answered the IDE question. The variable values in CSV. Can we store the variable values in CSV and pull values from CSV during play?
It's possible, but I'd say that's not the usual way that people use Ansible, because it's looking for these particular structures of YAML files. So you can load in text files and parse them through and feed them in as variables at runtime. And so I'd say in your network engineering environment, that's actually might be a good place to start, because your other network engineers that you're working with may or may not be ready to learn Ansible or have time to. And so you want to have ways of introducing your automation to the team that are relevant and easily accessible to them, where I think YAML, it's not rocket science, but it is a learning curve. And CSV files, not so much a learning curve, or Excel files. And so it's good to have a mindset of like, how am I building automation that's going to be not just for me to use in my own little ivory tower, but is going to be accessible to everybody. And CSV files is definitely a good way to start that, but you want to not in there or stay there too long, I would say necessarily. You want to keep progressing, because I think it's going to be more difficult to maintain that in the long run, even though the Ansible variable system is not, it does have its own complexity to it. It does have its own benefits where it's creating this hierarchy and sorting for you in the background.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's a really good answer, Jason. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then yep, let's see, we confirmed that VS Code is the IDE
Yeah.
being used. And then there was a question, and I'm not sure if it's a little bit too in depth for the time that we have left. If so, maybe we can take it to the forum and follow up in writing a little bit. But
Sure.
you let us know, Jason, how you feel about tackling this next question. And then Carlo, I'll hand it back to you and we can kind of wrap up and whatnot for the live session.
Right.
So Taj asked, what are the debug options for a sub play level?
So debugging in Ansible is not like probably the easiest thing. Python is why a lot of people use Nornir and other solutions to when they get more interested in debugging things. But when you say sub play level, I'd have to dig more into that question to see exactly what they're looking at.
Yeah.
I'd say things that I typically do when I am debugging a playbook. I'll just give here quickly. Is that if I have a playbook like we have our initial one here, zero blah 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 blah. So let's say I have this playbook here. I have one play here, and for some reason this first task, whatever it's doing, is just not working. I'm going to comment out everything in the playbook, and I do that by just highlighting it, and I do command backslash, and then boom, it's all commented. And then I try to run it again and see if that works. And so that's usually how I start my debugging in Ansible, just as quick and dirty, is like, let me isolate just piece by piece, and then once that works, then I'm going to highlight and do command backslash and then uncomment another task. And then from there, another option is using the Ansible built-in debug, which is basically just a print out to screen. And so I'll start printing out to screen or the variables that I'm working with to make sure that the values in between my tasks are actually what they should be. So I'd say that's kind of the easiest way to debug. There are more advanced features in terms of debugging within Ansible, but that's like a whole nother webinar on its own.
Yeah. Excuse me. I was kind of figuring to take a little more deep diving to kind of keep going, but that's a really good brief answer that you gave, Jason.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Carlo, we do have a number of other questions in the Q&A.
Correct.
But I'm looking, in the interest of time, and I know we only booked Jason for the 30-minute session, but we did talk about doing follow-up in the forum post in, excuse me, in the DevNet community, excuse me, on CLN. So I think I saw you sharing the link to that open discussion thread, and you have the QR code here.
Exactly. So feel free to use your mobile device to go ahead and copy what's on the display. That link is also in the chat. You'll actually see both part 1 and part 2. Part 2 will house today's session recording as well. So do definitely bookmark both. Yeah. Jason, awesome presentation. A lot of info there, and we do see a lot of questions. So I do encourage everyone to go ahead and jump onto the Cisco Learning Network to ask those questions. And Jason's on there as well as myself and various others on there. Jason, is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up?
No, I say just like the other one, a lot of this you just have to learn by doing it. You have to work through examples, and even if you don't have an Ansible set up, like playing around with those online tools for Jinja 2 and YAML, like that's just kind of how you get the rhythm going.
Awesome. Matt, yourself, would you like to say anything, any parting words?
No, just thank you for your time, Jason. Thank you for everybody that attended. And we'll keep the discussion going just like we did last week in the forum thread. So looking forward to seeing some more activity in there as well and participation. So thank you, Jason.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Carl. See ya.
Awesome.
Bye,
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, bye. We'll see you next time. Again, that information is in the chat, so definitely do bookmark those. Hope to see you on the Cisco Learning Network. And until next time, take it easy. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.